Hey, it's me, Vicky Marie. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in this crazy world we're living in. So I'm hoping to in this live this morning. I've started a little bit early. Sorry, I've got classes later, Spanish classes. Got quite a few this morning, but I wanted to come on and do a live, and I'm hoping that we can watch together the statement that Keir Starmer is going to make about this case. Hi, Daniel. And so what happened yesterday was that sort of bit of a shock, really, decision by Axel Rudakubana to plead guilty, because previously in this horrible case of these three little girls who were murdered, and of course so many other people injured in Southport last summer, originally the judge had registered a plea of not guilty, but actually Axel Rudakubana had not pled not guilty. He had not said anything, and the judge registered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. Then yesterday, sort of just out of the blue, before the trial had even really started properly, and the trial was supposed to last several weeks, it would have been really quite unpleasant, wouldn't it, for the family, etc. Axel decided to plead guilty, and that's the only thing he said. He would not speak to acknowledge his name even or anything. I mean, this man, he definitely, man, boy, whatever you want to call him, you can see he's got severe mental health issues. Or he's just evil or possessed or something, he's actually, to see his, now that photos have been released of him, it really is, he really does look quite terrifying, doesn't he? You can see, I'm going to just show you the thumbnail. You can see that this boy is not right. Anyway, now it turns out that, like on the thumbnail, I was asking, is there a cover-up? Because, of course, the police were very reluctant to release the fact that he had actually been in his house was an Al-Qaeda training manual. He'd been also in his house was ricin, like a sort of crude bomb-making equipment. And the police are still saying they don't think this case is terror related. Anyway, the good news is, if you like, there is going to be an inquiry into this case. And as I say, Keir Starmer is going to talk this morning. Secretary of State Yvette Cooper announced yesterday. Hopefully they're going to start being more transparent now about the case, and what they're saying is that initially, before the guilty sort of plea, they had to be careful about what was said, etc., because they didn't want to prejudice his trial. Now, of course, he's pled guilty. There's not going to be a trial. There'll be sentencing on Thursday. He's going to get a life sentence. It's just a question of how long a life sentence that he receives, isn't it? So hopefully now then we will start to get some truth from the police, from the government, etc., about this case. I think, it is quite an extraordinary case, not only because of the actual act itself, which was uniquely horrible, but because of the riots that started afterwards. And it was a very sort of delicate position, wasn't it, that the police were in, and there was a lot of false rumours going around, false names. At the end of the day, I do think this case is terror related in one way, because, he had this manual, and he was looking into bomb making equipment. But now it's turning out that this boy's got a history of violence. In fact, I'm just going to take his photo off, because looking at those eyes gives you the heebie-jeebies, doesn't it? He has got a history of violence, fascination with death, knives. He has done other things. He was under the care of mental services. He was under the attention of Prevent, which is a government organisation to try and prevent terrorism or prevent acts just like this. Honestly, on they were so incompetent. They should call themselves allow instead of prevent. They failed miserably. How many times does someone have to be drawn to someone's attention? How many things do they have to do? This boy, the more you look into it, he was just the primest candidate you could imagine for having, a 24-hour guard on him, really, because he was he was always going to do something like this. He was like a bomb waiting to go off himself. He was an accident waiting to happen. And unfortunately, little Elsie, BB and Alice, they paid the ultimate price for the incompetence of Prevent and everybody else that was dealing with this case. Now, the thing is, yes, he committed the ultimate crime. It was him who did it. But, I know you can only look back and see red flags in hindsight, but it does seem in this case, there were lots of red flags. Anyway, we're just going to have a look at what I'm waiting for. I'm hoping to be able to show you, hoping for us to be able to watch it live, is Keir Starmers' statement that he's going to make this morning. Very shortly, I'm keeping an eye on Sky News for when it starts. While we're just waiting for that to happen, I'm just going to show you this video from Channel 4 News yesterday. Let's see.
Let me start with the news that we've just heard in the last hour or so this evening, that there is to be a public inquiry. The Home Office saying that there were known concerns about Axel Rudakubana before he carried out this murder, that he'd been in contact with multiple state agencies. There'd been 3 referrals even to the government's Prevent programme, and contact with police, the courts, youth justice, social services and mental health services, we're told.
So did you hear that? So 3 reports to Prevent. We probably won't have time this morning, but later this afternoon, I'm hoping to do another live. So I want to talk to you about Prevent, which is this government organisation that's supposed to prevent things like this happening. 3 times he was investigated by them, and they decided there was no terror motive. I mean, for God's sake.
Between them, the Home Office says those agencies failed to identify the terrible risk and danger that he posed. That information now being made public because the legal restrictions that were in place to ensure a fair trial, they don't apply now, because with those guilty pleas this morning, there will be no trial. And I have to say, it was completely unexpected when it happened in court this morning, when Axel Rudakubana, now 18, he was 17 at the time when this happened, changed his pleas to all counts to guilty. So unexpected, in fact, that the families of the victims were not in court when it happened.
Yeah, so they weren't expecting that at all yesterday. And as she says, the families of the victims weren't in court because they were expecting the trial to get going properly today. And now, I don't know, they probably would have liked to have been in court to hear him plead guilty. I'm sure they'll be in court on Thursday when the sentence is given. And the judge has already said it's going to be a life sentence. So the only question is, how long? Is it going to be a whole life tariff? I've been looking up about whole life tariffs, so we'll be talking about them. When I've got more time to do a video later, I want to look into Prevent, this organisation. I want to look into what we can expect. What are the pluses and minuses of whole life tariffs? Are they a good thing? Some people don't agree with them. It was interesting, something that I was just reading just before I started this video. That a reason that a lot of prison services, etc., don't like whole life tariffs is because if someone's got a whole life tariff, they don't care about their behaviour. When they're in prison, because they can't come out anyway, they get no kudos for good behaviour. There's one particular prisoner who went on to kill 3 other prisoners. while he was serving his whole life tariff, couldn't give a flying F about anything because he knows he's not coming out anyway. Might as well just kill another few people while I'm at it. So there's that. And we're going to look at that. It'll be interesting to talk about that, but I probably won't have time now.
That's something the judge apologised for. And with what we're now learning this evening, it seems clear there will need to be many more apologies about all of this. The more we know about what he did, the more questions there are, and inevitably, more upset and anger too. Axel Rudakubana was 17 when he went to a children's dance class armed with a knife and unleashed an attack so awful, it's hard to find the words. According to prosecutors, it was meticulously planned. It was also horrifically violent.
So, he got in a taxi, didn't he? There was a video of him pacing up and down outside his house. Unfortunately, his parents mustn't have been in that day because it's now transpired that not long before this happened, he tried to get a taxi to his old school where he was going to cause some damage, etc. And luckily, that day, or maybe unluckily, depends which way you look at it, for these 3 girls who got murdered on the second attempt he made to cause mayhem, wasn't good luck. But for his school at the time, I expect it was, he was going to go to the school and, cause a lot of problems as they were finishing up for the summer. And his father stopped him from getting this taxi and going. So I expect his parents were at their wits' end with Axel because it seems to me that they knew that he was deteriorating down some sort of slippery mental health slope, and they, I just cannot believe all these red flags, and yet it was still allowed to happen. I just, it's awful. I mean, this is probably one of the most awful things that's ever happened in Britain, isn't it? It's like, well, it's like the Dunblane massacre or anything like that. It's on that level. The chaos that he caused, the terror that he caused, killing 3 little girls and the other ones that he attempted to kill. Imagine how they've got to live with that. They've got to cope with that, the trauma, enduring trauma. It's a horrible, horrible crime, this.
All right, cheers.
These are the 3 girls he murdered. Alice, age 9, Bibi, who was 6, and Elsie, age 7. 8 other children and 2 adults were stabbed but survived.
This was an unspeakable attack, one which has left an enduring mark on our community and the nation for its savagery and senselessness.
Right, I'm going to pop over to Sky News because I've just been keeping an eye on it and I can see that they're outside, so it's coming up soon.
Sensitivities and only driven by the pursuit of justice. So quite robust words from the Prime Minister, and I think this is because of a concerning detail that has emerged, which is the fact that Axel Rudakubana was referred to prevent 3 times when he was aged about 13 or 14. And that's particularly concerning, that those risks and the danger that he was to the public hadn't been addressed.
Here we go, our leader.
We might hear more about that Prevent programme.
Girls in Southport is a devastating moment in our history. No words come anywhere close to expressing the brutality and horror in this case. Every parent in Britain will have had the same thought. It could have been anywhere. It could have been our children. But it was Southport. It was Bibi, 6 years old. Elsie, 7. Alice, 9. Back in August, I said there would be a time for questions, but that first justice had to be done, and that above all, we must not interfere with the work of the police, the prosecutors, and the delivery of that justice. Well, yesterday, thankfully, a measure of justice was done, but it won't bring those girls back to their families, and it won't remove the trauma from the lives of those who were injured. their lives will never be the same. So before I turn to the questions that must now be answered for the families and the nation, I first want to recognise their unimaginable grief, because I know the whole country grieves for them. The tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those 3 young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. In pursuit of that, we must, of course, ask and answer difficult questions, questions that should be far-reaching, unburdened by cultural or institutional sensitivities, and driven only by the pursuit of justice. That is what we owe the families. The responsibility for this barbaric act lies, as it always does, with the vile individual who carried it out. But that is no comfort. And more importantly, it is no excuse. And so, as part of the inquiry launched by the Home Secretary yesterday, I will not let any institution of the state deflect from their failure. Failure which, in this case, frankly, leaps off the page. For example, the perpetrator was referred to the PREVENT programme on 3 separate occasions. In 2019, once, and in 2021, twice. Yet on each of these occasions, a judgment was made that he did not meet the threshold for intervention, a judgment that was clearly wrong and which failed those families. And I acknowledge that here today. Throughout this case, to this point, we have only been focused on justice. If this trial had collapsed because I or anyone else had revealed crucial details while the police were investigating, while the case was being built, while we were awaiting a verdict, then the vile individual who committed these crimes would have walked away a free man. The prospect of justice destroyed for the victims and their families. I would never do that. And nobody would ever forgive me if I had. That is why the law of this country forbade me or anyone else from disclosing details sooner. Nonetheless, it is now time for those questions. And the first of those is whether this was a terrorist attack. The blunt truth here is that this case is a sign. Britain now faces a new threat. Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organized groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety, sometimes inspired by traditional terrorist groups, but fixated on that extreme violence, seemingly for its own sake. Now, it may well be that people like this are harder to spot, but we can't shrug our shoulders and accept that. We can't have a national security system that fails to tackle people who are a danger to our values, our security, our children. We have to be ready to face every threat. And when I look through the details of this case, the extreme nature of the violence, the meticulous plan to attack young children in a place of joy and safety, violence clearly intended to terrorize, then I understand why people wonder what the word terrorism means. And so if the law needs to change to recognize this new and dangerous threat, then we will change it, and quickly. And we will also review our entire counter-extremist system to make sure we have what we need to defeat it. Now, that work is already underway. I've tasked Sir David Anderson Casey, the new independent Prevent Commissioner, to hold this system to account, to shine a light into its darkest corners, so the British people can have confidence that action will follow words. But I have to say, to face up to this new threat, there are also bigger questions. Questions such as how we protect our children from the tidal wave of violence freely available online. Because you can't tell me that the material this individual viewed before committing these murders should be accessible on mainstream social media platforms, that with just a few clicks, people can watch video after horrific video, videos that in some cases are never taken down. No, that cannot be right. But it's not just the nightmares of the online world, because when you wake from a nightmare, the first thing you do is reassure yourself with reality. But for far too many people, the state of our society no longer does that. Now, people will say this is all because of immigration or all because of funding cuts. But in truth, neither tells us anything like the full story or explains this case properly. No, this goes deeper. A growing sense that the rights and responsibilities that we owe to one another, the set of unwritten rules that hold a nation together, have in recent years been ripped apart. Children who've stopped going to school since the pandemic. Young people who've opted out of work or education. More and more people retreating into parallel lives, whether through failures of integration or just a country slowly turning away from itself. Wounds that politics, for all that it may have contributed, must try to heal. Thirdly, there are also questions about the accountability of the Whitehall and Westminster system, a system that is far too often driven by circling the institutional wagons, that does not react until justice is either hard won by campaigners or until appalling tragedies like this finally spur a degree of action. Time and again, we see this pattern. And people are right to be angry about it. I'm angry about it. Southport must be a line in the sand. But nothing will be off the table in this inquiry. Nothing. And most importantly, it will lead to change. I know people will be watching right now, and they'll be saying, we've heard all this before, the promises, the sorrow, the inquiry that comes and goes, an inability to change that, frankly, has become the oxygen of wider conspiracy. And we've seen that throughout this case. A suggestion that there has been a cover-up. I want to put on record that yesterday's guilty verdict only happened because hundreds, if not thousands, of dedicated public servants worked towards it, many of whom endured absolutely harrowing circumstances, particularly in the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. That is their job. They are brilliant at it, but we should never forget their service to our country. Law and order depend on them. And yet I'm under no illusions that until the wider state shows the country it can change, not just what it delivers for people, but also its culture, then this atmosphere of mistrust will remain. So I want to be crystal clear in front of the British people today. We will leave no stone unturned. I was the prosecutor who first spotted failures in grooming cases in my institution, the CPS, 14 years ago. And I was the prosecutor who first did something about it by bringing the rape gangs in Rochdale to justice. And so my approach as Prime Minister will be no different. If any shortcomings are now holding back the ability of this country to keep its citizens and its children safe, I will find them and I will root them out. Because when it comes to justice, the failure to be transparent is not only disgraceful on its own terms, it is also the enemy of strong communities. It spreads suspicion more widely and allows division to win. I remember when this happened, in those dark days of the summer. And I remember that, like now, the whole country grieved for Southport. But I also remember how it was profoundly moved by their example. Because even as that community faced an unimaginable evil, even as they had to endure mindless violence, bricks and bottles thrown at their community, their businesses, their mosque, police officers attacked, including those who are on the scene responding to this vile murder. Even despite all of that, they chose to come together. They chose to pick up the pieces of their lives. They chose to rebuild, brick by brick, side by side. Strangers no longer strangers, a community. This country has no shortage of empathy for the people of Southport. I know that. But in the face of such darkness and tragedy, what we really should do is follow their example. That is what we need to face this new threat. But also something more. Because national renewal isn't just about public services or the economy. It's about turning us back towards ourselves, giving people confidence in a shared future, so people can once again see the strength and power in themselves and in this nation. But that can only begin today by holding up the mirror and facing what we see. So wherever this inquiry goes, we will follow it. No matter the boats it will rock, no matter the vested interests it will threaten, we won't hide. But then, most importantly of all, we will act. Because this time it will be different. Southport will be a line in the sand. We will honour those 3 little girls and deliver not just justice, but the change that the people and families of Southport deserve. Thank you. I will now take a number of questions from the media, starting with Vicky Young from the BBC.
Prime Minister, you are a person with years of experience as a senior prosecutor. Do you really need a public inquiry to tell you that the system needs to change? And isn't there the possibility that that delay could mean that other dangerous cases are missed in the meantime?
I think we need a public inquiry to answer all of the questions that the families, the people of Southport and the country have about this case, and to ensure that no stone is unturned, that every failure is exposed and dealt with. I also think we need an inquiry because we are dealing with a new cohort, a different threat, this individualised extreme violence, and we have to have the laws and framework in place to deal with it. But I accept your challenge. We shouldn't wait until the end of the inquiry before we start the change. And that's why already there's been a review of what happened with Prevent and the findings and learnings from that, so that the mistakes that were made then would not be made today. That is really important in reassuring the public. Why we've appointed a commissioner to look into that whole part of the apparatus, and why we will get on with some of the work we need to get on with changing, for example, the law when it comes to the framework for dealing with extreme violence. So we do need the inquiry so we have the full picture, full accountability, and every single question that the families have is properly answered in the proper way. But we need to get on with the change in the meantime, and to reassure the public that every step is being taken to protect their children. Thank you. Beth Rigby, Sky News.
Beth Rigby, Sky News, thank you. Prime Minister, it now emerges the perpetrator was known to the authorities and had been referred to Prevent, the anti-terrorism programme, 3 times. He'd had contact with the police, the courts, the justice, the youth system and mental health services. It's a catastrophic failure of the state to protect those young girls. Do you acknowledge that if that information had come out when the riots were happening, it would have provoked further outrage by the public, so you withheld information? Is that true? And do you acknowledge that whatever happens now, whatever public inquiry you carry out, this will hugely undermine trust from the public in the authorities and your government? Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Let me be clear. Responsibility for the disorder and the violence lies with those that perpetrated it. We need to be really clear about that. But let me address the facts as you put them to me. There has been a failure here, and I don't intend to let any institution of the state deflect from their failures, and I acknowledge that readily here. Yes, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice in a case such as this. But you know and I know that it would not have been right to disclose those details. The only losers, if the details had been disclosed, would be the victims and the families, because it ran the risk the trial would collapse. I'm never going to do that. Never going to do that, because they deserve that justice. And only by having the rules in place can that justice be delivered, as a measure of it now has. And I wouldn't be forgiven if I had. Those are not just my choices, though it is a choice I would make. It is also the law of the land. That is why I couldn't disclose the details. It's why others couldn't disclose the details. It's why all of you as journalists couldn't disclose the details, because the same laws applied to you just as they applied to me. And it's really important that we make that clear. But the purpose of the rule is to protect the justice that the families and the victims are entitled to. I think that's the right thing. It is now right, having got to this stage, that the questions are asked and the answers are given, which is why we've taken the course of an inquiry, but also why between now and the conclusion of the inquiry, we will happily answer any questions that are put to us. But that is why, notwithstanding that, yes, I was being kept updated, of course, I did not disclose anything that would collapse the trial and defeat justice in this case. And I don't think anybody could ever have looked the victims and their families in the eye if they'd ever done that. Thank you, Beth. Can I have Paul Brand, please, from ITV?
Paul Brand from ITV. Thank you, Prime Minister. All of us, as you say, as journalists, understand the risk of contempt of court, of prejudicing a trial. But we live in a different age now, don't we, where misinformation and disinformation spreads at lightning speed online. I was in Southport on the day of the attacks. There was a short window in which information could have been released before charge, before any risk of prejudicing a trial, Why didn't you do that? And do you think it was a mistake not to provide that detail then?
Firstly, let me address part of your... Look, it is true that we live in a different age in that available information is now available online as well as offline. And I understand the frustration of all, but including some journalists who observe the rules and don't report what they know because they know that the law doesn't permit it and it runs the risk of collapsing a trial, only to see information online that doesn't appear to be following the same rules. And that is not acceptable. That has to be addressed and it'll be part of what we will be looking at, because that can't be right. But in relation to the central thrust of your question, the importance of the rule about not disclosing this information is to ensure that the trial can take place and that where an individual is guilty, they're held to account, as has now happened in this case. And that is why the law carefully restricts what can be said by anyone, not just me as Prime Minister, but anybody in these circumstances. And it is done to protect the family and their victims. That is the right thing, and that is what the law requires. It's also the choice I would make to ensure that my first thoughts are about justice for the victims and their families. That, for me, is first and foremost. Yes, we can answer questions, and we are now doing so with this inquiry and everything that will happen before the end of that inquiry. That is quite right. But it is also right that the families who've been through unimaginable grief at least have the comfort now of an outcome in this particular case. And you would be putting very different questions to me if I had disclosed information and we were now faced with a decision that the trial had just collapsed and the families would never get justice. You would rightly be challenging me very, very hard about why I had disclosed information. Thank you very much, Paul. Chris from GB News.
Chris Hope, GB News. Prime Minister, given what we know now about the terror link and how it's kept from the public, do you now regret blaming the far right for all those protests last summer? Was it a far right issue, or were some people entitled to be concerned and upset, not the rioters?
Responsibility for the violence lies with them that perpetrated it. I was in Southport the day after these terrible murders. I was acknowledging and thanking the frontline police officers and ambulance who had been at the scene. You can imagine what they had been through. They were back at work the next day. They were saying it was just their job. I could see in their eyes the impact it had had on them, what they had to deal with, what they had to see, how they endured that. As I arrived back in London, those same officers were putting their riot gear on and having bricks thrown at them. Those same officers. I don't think anybody can justify that, nor should they attempt to do so. Thank you, Chris. Harry from The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sorry to labour this point, but I think it's important. All summer, we were repeatedly told that the Southport attack was not terror-related, wasn't being treated as terror-related. That wasn't true. Because in October, Monster was charged with a terror offence. Now, information was put into the public domain then that didn't collapse the trial. It didn't jeopardise justice. It was just months later. Now, you say you knew about the ricin and the Al-Qaeda bomb manual, and it was known to the authorities. Did you know about that personally at the same time the public, the press, and the police were saying this is not terror-related? Because I think that's the nub of the issue, and that's what's upset people. You say you couldn't speak out publicly, that you couldn't do that, but didn't the public have a right to know, not least the neighbours who had ricin being produced on their street? Surely they had a right to know.
Well, I think there are two separate and important issues there, Harry. The first is on the question of terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. And my concern in this case is that we have clearly got an example of extreme violence, individualized violence, that we have to protect our children from and our citizens from. And it is a new threat. It's not what we would have usually thought of as terrorism when definitions were drawn up, when guidelines were put in place, when the framework was put in place. And we have to recognise that here today, because I think most people would say, looking at the facts of this case, it's clearly extreme violence, it's clearly intended to terrorise. And I completely accept and understand that, and that is my view. Therefore, we have to make sure that the law and the framework for responding is appropriate to the new threat that we face. And there we will make whatever changes are necessary in the law to deal with it. On the second point, yes, of course, I was kept up to date with the facts as they were emerging. That is usual practice. But just like you, as a journalist, I had to observe the law of the land. It was not my personal decision to withhold this information, any more than it was a journalist's personal decision not to print or write about it. That is the law of the land that is in place for the reasons I've set out, to protect the integrity of the system, to ensure that the victims and their families get the justice that they deserve. Thank you, Harry. And Jason from the Mail.
Thanks, PM. Jason Groves from the Daily Mail. It sounds from what you're saying like you personally consider this to have been a terrorist attack in the ordinary sense of the word. Is that right? And also, it sounds like you don't think that this is a one-off. Should people be worried? And are we going to need further protections in schools, youth centres? Because this guy seems to have had some sort of obsession with school massacres.
Well, thank you for raising that, because I think this is a really central issue, because, as I say, this is extreme violence, clearly intended to terrorise. And my concern is that because it is different to the sort of behaviour we've associated with terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and there are plenty of other examples, which tended to be more organised in groups with a clear political ideology and motive. Because it's not that, it is a new and different threat, it doesn't fit as well as it should within our framework, within our toolbox. And that is what we've got to change. That is the urgent question that has to be addressed. And it's one that has to be addressed before the conclusion of the inquiry. And it's why we've already done the learning from the prevent mistakes. But it is that cohort. I do think it's new. You've seen versions of it in America with some of the mass shootings in schools. It is not an isolated, ghastly example. It is, in my view, an example of a different kind of threat. And that is why I'm absolutely so determined that we will rise to that challenge and make sure that our law, our response is capable, appropriate, and can deal with that sort of threat. But that is my concern, that is my thinking, that this is a new threat, individualised, extreme violence, obsessive, often following online viewing of material from all sorts of different sources. It is not a one-off, it is something that we all need to understand and have a shared undertaking to deal with within our society. And that is not just the laws on terrorism, the framework on terrorism, it's also the laws on what we can access online. We still have rules in place in this country about what you can see at a cinema. And yet online, you can access no end of material. We have to ensure that we can rise to this new challenge. And that is what I'm determined to do. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
That was the Prime Minister speaking to reporters in Downing Street. More details there following that guilty plea to 16 charges by Axel Rudakubana.
Okay, so there you go. There's the speech by our Führer, our leader. And, you know, I can see in your comments, people, do you know what I've found is people just don't, if somebody doesn't like someone, they don't even really listen to what they're saying. They just decide, you know, I do it with Donald Trump. I can't stand him. It doesn't matter what he says. I'll never agree with what he says. So anyway, I thought it was interesting. I think I've been saying it for ages about bedroom terrorists. They are different. These are people who aren't maybe part. I know he had the Al-Qaeda manual, but he's not. They couldn't find any evidence that it was part of a group. I'm not saying it wasn't terrorist related. Of course, it was terrorist related, but that's different from people in organised groups going out and doing things. These people, like Axel, really, he's just a teenager he started off a teenager in his room with mental health issues, obsessions with violence, obsessions with knives, COVID's come along and he's stuck in his bedroom. Then he's probably, never really recovered from that. And he's been planning, so he was like a bomb waiting to go off. But what I think Keir Starmer's trying to say there is he's not part of a group. There was no evidence to find that it was part of a group. So when Prevent have looked at, don't get me wrong, I'm not agreeing with any of it. It was all a total failure by everybody. This guy should have been nipped in the bud. From 13 years old, they've known. 3 times he's been investigated by anti-terrorism, Prevent. Then he's been involved with like mental health professionals and this, that and the other. His father's had to stop him one day from going to his old school to committing some atrocity there. He's just like red flags everywhere with Axel. And he was never picked up enough where I don't know, what should they have done with him? Maybe they should have arrested him when he was threatening to go to his school and sort of kill a load of people. I don't know. I think this is the whole point. If you listen to what Keir Starmer was saying, whether you like him or you don't like him, he's the Prime Minister. He's got to deal with this. It's the same with Donald Trump. I don't like Donald Trump. Don't matter if you like him or you don't. He's the president, and you just have to see what he ends up doing. Maybe Donald Trump might make a positive influence. I don't know. But, same with Keir Starmer. Like him or not, he's the Prime Minister. So he's got to deal with it, and he's dealing with it. And he says there's going to be an inquiry. He's going to change the definition of terrorism. There's this new terrorist threat. These people I just don't know what you can do with these people. I've done videos about this before. Someone sat in their bedroom. To me, why this probably started with COVID, but it's not only COVID. It's just the internet. Young people socialize online now. They don't even have to go out of their room to socialize. Do you know what I mean? Like years ago, if you didn't go out of your room and go out and mix in society, you never met anyone, you never, had any sort of social life. These young people now, they have social lives in their room, but they don't go to school. There's all this, it's too much. Sorry, I know even some of you watching, your children are homeschooling. I think there's a case for homeschooling, of course, in certain circumstances. But I think it's too much now. It's too many children being homeschooled. It's too many young people not working. I agree. Get out, get to work. People, especially young people, need to socialise. Or they're sat at home, they're watching all sorts of violent things. You can find anything online just like that. Nothing, sometimes when I'm scrolling down on X, the things that come up, I don't want to see them, but you don't have a control over them. They come up before, the video starts playing just as you scroll down, and you see all sorts of horrible things, not only violent things, but sex things and what have you. I don't want to see them. So I can see it. Any young person can see it. Anyone who's sitting there with uncontrolled internet access can see all these things. Now, there's a lot of young people who will watch things like that and it won't affect them in an adverse way. But to me, it's almost like alcohol or drugs or anything. Some people can drink alcohol and not, it doesn't make them go and do ridiculous things like riot or whatever. Some people can take drugs in a recreational way. It doesn't make them go off and murder people, or they don't stop, taking drugs every day just as a way of getting through a day. Some people can't. It's almost like if you already had some sort of a mental, I don't know, predilection to, for whatever reason, if you already had some sort of mental health issues, watching all these horrible things on the internet's not going to help, is it? So the thing is, I don't know what the answer is. I'm not saying I know what the answer is. You can't ban the internet, can you? That's not going to happen. So I don't know what the answer is. All I know is there's a lot of young people sitting at home watching probably horrible things. If they're being, like, sounds like he was maybe bullied at school or whatever. Most children are bullied at school one way or another. And that makes you vulnerable then to groups that sort of I don't know, ideas that make you feel part of something, and that makes you more vulnerable to radicalization or whatever. So, as I say, I don't know what the answer is. All I know is I'm glad that there's going to be an inquiry. And I want to come on and talk more about, I can see it, you know, it gets people, what's the word? You know, everyone's got their views on this, and, you know, we can talk about our views. We can have different views. We, hopefully we don't fall out over it. You know, we all do have different views, but, you know, one thing that we are all, I think, determined on, or all in agreement on, we don't want this to happen again. The more I look at this, I just think, I cannot believe that this was allowed to happen. It does feel like it was allowed to happen. They cannot look back and say they had no idea, you know, that this came out of nowhere. Sometimes things do come out of nowhere, but not with this boy. This boy, I expect his family's had a nightmare. You know, it's hard to, I do, you know, if any, there may be some of you that have experienced this with young people with mental health issues, so difficult to deal with. And, you know, I know in the UK there's waiting lists, aren't they, for sort of mental health professionals. You know, I know from experiences in my family that just luckily, you know, people had the financial resources to be able to find private people to help, because they were told there was a 2-year waiting list before their young person could be seen by mental health professionals. And, you know, some young people that have mental health issues, they harm themselves. Axel went off and harmed other people, these poor children. But, you know, how many young people harm themselves as well? You know, it's just, I think it's a crisis, not only in Britain. I think in a lot of places. I know in Australia they've got similar crisis. I was watching one of those 60 Minutes programs about it. The young people's mental health is in crisis, and it won't have been helped by COVID, and it won't be helped by keeping children off school. You know, to me, even if children have to learn how to be in society, don't they? Otherwise, you know, and society is hard. You know, I've had this argument, you know, often with my own son, and with children are cruel. People are cruel. You go, you know, you leave school and you go into the workplace, you still get bullies. You've got to learn how to deal with things. You've got to learn how to deal with life, because life is hard. And, you know, sitting in your bedroom, you know, playing video games is not going to help, is it? But anyway, okay, I've got to go because I've got some classes. I'll probably be back later because I wanted to show you who the Prevent people are, this government organisation that failed completely. I wanted to look at the life tariffs and talk about what sort of a sentence we can expect for Axel. We know it's going to be we know it's going to be a life sentence. We just don't know what. So we're going to have a look at that. And yeah. Okay, so thanks for watching. Thanks for chatting, but keep, you know, being nice, playing nice. You know, we all, we have our view. I can say, obviously, people feel really strongly about this. It's impossible not to feel strongly about it. And I think one thing we can all agree on is definitely these girls were let down one way or another by the system that didn't work, did it? So it does need changing. Okay, so I'll see you soon in the next video, and until then, may your God go with you, and please remember to subscribe for updates about this case and any other that we're covering. Thank you so much. Have a good day. I'll see you soon in the next video, and until then, may your God always go with you. Bye.